fourth and last paper by Ken Opalo from Stanford University.
Yeah, and speaking of executive constraint, I'm here to talk about legislative elections in Africa, focusing on Kenya and Zambia. So the main motivation of the dissertation project, and this is a chapter of the dissertation that I'm trying to spin off as a paper, is this observed variation in legislative strength in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is a puzzle because beginning in the mid-60s, scholars pretty much gave up on African legislatures, saying that they were inconsequential in the policy-making process. There'll be rubber stamps and residual to the politics of the polities in which they existed. However, looking at the legislatures in Africa, even during one-party rule, we see important differences. And I argue that these differences meant a lot for the trajectories that African countries took in terms of having free and fair elections, having more constrained presidents, and also just for intra-elite politics post-transition in the early 1990s. And so in the dissertation I asked this broader question: what explains the divergence in parliamentary strength in sub-Saharan Africa in the early 1990s? We see quite a bit of divergence, as I showed in the opening map. And in this particular presentation, I look at what explains incumbency advantage in African elections, which is an element of legislative strength. If you imagine an institution requiring institutional memory, specialization, and just experience over time, it matters whether you have a turnover rate of 60% or a lower turnover rate, which allows for institutional development. And incumbency advantage is one way of developing this kind of institutional competence that comes with time. Having a speaker who's a freshman is a lot different than having a speaker who's a 30-year veteran. And so, yes, the argument I'm making is that the differences can be explained by legacies of autocratic rule, because many autocrats rule with legislatures, and they control them in different ways. So there's a big difference between autocrats who rule by mass parties or elite parties. I argue that mass parties are bad for legislative development in the sense that they allow the ruler to circumvent elites to have a direct access to the masses. Elite parties, on the other hand, are good for institutional development in the sense that elites autonomously mobilize their supporters and therefore able to bargain more strongly with the ruler. And then secondly, there are differences in strategies of containing legislatures. So you can imagine a president who relies on the veto, so that he allows the legislature to carry out its process and vetoes the outcome, or one who actually micromanages the actual legislative process to engineer a favorable outcome. Now, the observable implication of both strategies is the same. The autocrat always gets what they want, but using a veto allows the legislature to develop the capacity to handle the legislative processes, while the micromanagement strategy kind of stifles this development. And so that, when we look at African legislatures during one-party rule, they may all have seemed to be the same, in that the outcomes are always consistent with the preferences of presidents. But I argue that the processes that are arriving at those outcomes were different, and that this became manifest once you removed the veil of one-party rule in the early 1990s and allowed for, legislators had outside options, so they didn't always have to conform to what the president wanted. And I'll show you in a bit some of these outcomes. And so, just on theory, all rulers need the cooperation of elites, and legislatures, even under autocracy, are useful in this regard. So, Gandhi has a famous book on autocratic institutions, showing that these institutions are not a phenomenon, they're not mere window dressing, they actually have an important function under autocracy. But the ruler always needs to retain the veto power to veto these institutions, because if you're an autocrat, you create a strong institution, there's potential to be overthrown by the same institution. So there's always that caveat that yes, autocratic institutions make a difference, but they're ultimately subject to veto by the ruler. And so, getting more narrowly to the question of legislators, under autocracy, you have the legislator having two principles: the president and the voters. And now in pure democracies, this link is typically very weak. So, and same with this link. So the legislature is accountable directly to voters. They also do not serve the function of regime agents. They typically, concentrate on the left-hand side, and that makes for a strong legislature because these functions, directly monitored by the principal. Now, in autocracy, you have these other links, which weaken the legislature because if the president, now under the mass party system, if the president is the intermediary between the voters and the legislature, they weaken the legislatures. They don't have power to create their own independent basis by having this direct link, and that may weaken their capacity to function. So the ability of the legislature to bargain with the president determines the power of the legislature, which in turn determines the ability of the individual member of the legislature to develop an independent power base. And so I focus on the ability to extract resources from the executive branch because if patronage is the currency of politics, we call it constituency service in advanced democracies, we call it patronage elsewhere, it's all the same. Let's call it constituency service. That's the currency of politics. Then the member of parliament needs resources to maintain the constituency office, to pay for school fees, attend Harambes, etc. And that ability is conditional on whether the autocrat is willing to allow them to do that. Yes. And so, looking at Kenya and Zambia, I argue that although these two countries were very similar at the beginning, over time, the nature of autocratic rule set them on different trajectories. So that, by the early 1990s, even though Kenya and Zambia were both under, one-party rule, presidents were consistently getting what they wanted, the processes in which they did so were different, and so by the early 1990s, the Kenyan parliament was actually stronger than its Zambian counterpart. And this was because of two key reasons. One is that, KANU, Moi tried to make KANU mass party but failed. UNIP, on the other hand, was your quintessential mass party with direct access to the people. Kaunda could circumvent elites. And so these differences meant that at the transition in the early 1990s, the Kenyan legislature was actually stronger than its Zambian counterpart. And you can see this in just the first 5 parliaments in both countries. So beginning in the mid-60s to 1990. And the relevant column here is, so this is the amount of time, you can see it as the amount of time spent on a particular legislation. You see that in Kenya, it's almost 4 times than Zambia for much of this period. The Kenyan parliament sits a lot more often and does not pass bills at 90% rates like the Zambian counterpart, and this is under one-party rule. So the president, this passage rate, especially at the beginning, is quite interesting because the president introduces things that he thinks should get passed, yet he gets stonewalled. And to show you the divergence that I'm talking about beginning in the early 1990s, is that, if you look at the budget allocation to parliament, this gets at things like staff, remuneration of members of parliament, etc. They look pretty similar, and this is in 2005 dollars. And then, beginning in the early 1990s, there's this rapid acceleration in Kenya, Zambia lines until Chiluba leaves office. That's when it starts to have an uptick. Staffing, Moi actually in the early 1990s, when the Kenyan parliament is getting stronger, he tries to reduce the staffing after Moi is gone. You see the legislature being able to take advantage of its independence. Salaries to members of parliament, comparing Kenya and Zambia. Again, much quicker jump in Kenya than Zambia after the 1990 turnover. This is exchange rate controls in Zambia. I think in real terms it was probably lower than this. What's interesting here is just the divergence after 1990. And just to give you a sense, Kenyan MPs are up there with Nigeria in terms of per capita income comparisons. Anyway, so what I'm trying to get at here is that at 1990, the legislatures look pretty similar. You see, rate of passage of bills. Kenya is doing better than Zambia, but not so much. You see this massive drop in Kenya. The share of bills introduced by the executive that get passed, not much in Zambia. And I'm arguing that the difference is here because at the point of transition, the Kenyan parliament was stronger than its Zambian counterpart. Same with executive decree authority. I'll not get too much into that. Now to focus on the key outcome of today, what I'm trying to do is then compare incumbency advantage before and after the transition. Because my argument is that two countries look similar during one-party rule, but diverge after the end of one-party rule, and the explanation is that the Kenyan legislature is stronger at the point of transition. So what I do is estimate incumbency advantage using an RD design, so comparing candidates who barely lost and those who barely won in time t, and comparing them at time t plus 1 to see how they perform in the elections. Just to give you a sense, we're talking of this guy's an incumbent in the previous election, he gets just over 30%. In the following election, he's close to 50%, and the non-incumbent declines. So comparing the differences that can be attributed to just the incumbency status. To do this, I got data from Kenya and Zambia beginning in mid-60s to 2007 in Kenya and in 2011 in Zambia. And the results are this, that in Kenya you see the flip after 1990. So under one-party rule, incumbents are disadvantaged in the sense that they lose to challengers. After 1990, they become advantaged. Incumbents are doing better than challengers. Turnover rate is still high, but comparing two comparable candidates, one is an incumbent, one is a challenger, incumbents are doing better. Zambia doesn't do as well. Incumbents, the point estimate is still higher, but it's not statistically significant. And this is just to show you the jumps that I'm talking about. So incumbents are disadvantaged in Kenya, it flips. In Zambia, it flips, but not by a lot. And so I'm explaining these differences by saying that, for a long time we've done incumbency advantage looking at just the relationship between the voter and the MP. And it's saying that MPs are effective and therefore they get voted out every year. But the MP needs resources to buy votes, and buy votes, in a general sense. So the MP cannot say, I passed a legislation that reduced inflation. The MP needs to say, I brought resources that built the bridge, I paid your school fees. And so the higher the share of the budget the parliament gets, or the more money MPs are paid, or the more resources they get for constituency service, the more advantaged they'll become. And so there's an institutional story beyond the political story that we hear about in incumbency advantage.